If someone had told me that my quiet, bookish wife would become the center of my biggest nightmare, I would have laughed and poured them another drink. Chloe, my wife of 8 years, loved two things: our family and literature. Or so I thought. Turns out, there was a third love, hidden between the dusty pages of a bookstore, smiling behind a counter, and scribbling secrets into a journal. I'm Aaron, 37, an IT consultant with a passion for logic and a knack for solving problems. Chloe, 34, is a freelance editor with a talent for weaving magic with words. Together, we built a simple, predictable life. Our shared evenings spent reading by the fire, weekend trips to secondhand bookstores, and our modest but warm home reflecting our love for the written word. I thought we had it all: stability, trust, and an understanding that came from years of partnership. But lately, Chloe had been different. It started with her newfound obsession with a local bookstore. At first, I thought it was charming. She discovered a quaint little shop tucked away on a quiet street, run by a man named Victor, who she said had an eye for rare finds. Chloe began going there weekly, sometimes twice a week, returning home with bags of books and a glow in her cheeks that I hadn't seen in a while. She'd gush about the ambience, the curated collection, and how Victor seemed to have an uncanny ability to recommend exactly what she needed. I didn't think much of it at first. Chloe had always loved bookstores, and I was glad she'd found one that sparked her joy. But then the visits became more frequent. What started as an occasional trip turned into a ritual. Every Tuesday and Friday afternoon, Chloe would pack her tote bag, scribble something in her notebook, and disappear for hours. When I asked about it, she'd smile and say something about needing inspiration or finding the perfect book for a client. Her excitement was contagious at first, but then it started to feel off. I noticed that she wasn't just buying books, she was writing more. Late at night, I'd find her at the kitchen table, her journal open, her pen moving furiously across the page. When I asked what she was working on, she'd smile and say it was just notes for a client's manuscript. But she never let me read them, which was strange, considering we'd always shared everything we wrote. And then there were the books themselves. One evening, while tidying up, I noticed a book on the shelf that didn't look like anything Chloe would normally buy. It was a slim, well-worn volume with no title on the cover. Inside, the pages were filled with handwritten notes in neat, slanted script. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't Chloe's notes. The handwriting was precise, almost artistic, and the notes were cryptic, filled with phrases like, "The conversations we don't have are the ones that matter most," and "A story can't exist without two perspectives." My stomach churned as I turned the pages, the words becoming more personal, more intimate. I wanted to believe it was nothing, a gift from Victor, perhaps, or a marketing gimmick from the store. But my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, I decided to test a theory. I casually asked Chloe about the book, mentioning how interesting it looked. Her reaction was immediate. She froze for a moment, then quickly said it was just a recommendation from Victor and that it wasn't really her style. Her response was too quick, too rehearsed, and it only added to the unease growing inside me. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. Chloe's visits to the bookstore grew longer, and she became more secretive about her journal. When I passed by the shop one afternoon, I noticed her sitting at a small table near the counter, laughing with Victor as they leaned in close. It wasn't a casual interaction. There was something in her body language, in the way she touched her hair and smiled, that felt far too familiar. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I began piecing together the small details I'd been ignoring. The night she stayed up late, the sudden influx of books that didn't fit her usual taste, the cryptic notes that appeared in her journal. It all pointed to something I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. One evening, while Chloe was out at the bookstore, I opened her journal. It felt wrong, invasive even, but the curiosity and suspicion had grown too strong to resist. Inside, I found pages filled with her handwriting, interwoven with the same neat, slanted script I'd seen in the book. The entries were fragmented, like pieces of a conversation between two people. Chloe's words were reflective, almost poetic, while the other handwriting was more direct, almost teasing. Together, they painted a picture of a relationship that felt far too intimate to be professional. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. Every story has a turning point. Ours feels close. I closed the journal, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of what I'd just read. The cracks in our life, the signs I'd ignored, they were all starting to come together. Chloe wasn't just visiting a bookstore. She was weaving a story of her own, one that I wasn't a part of. After finding the journal, my mind was a whirlwind of denial and suspicion. I wanted to believe that Chloe's words were part of her work, some creative exercise or brainstorming for a client. But the pieces didn't fit. The notes weren't abstract or distant. They were intimate, deliberate, and carried an emotional weight that made my stomach twist. I couldn't look at Chloe the same way. Every smile she gave me felt hollow. Every excuse about her long bookstore visits felt rehearsed. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. I needed more, something undeniable, something that would force her to face the truth I was beginning to suspect. The following Tuesday, as Chloe packed her tote bag and headed out for another writing session, I decided to follow her. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but my instincts told me there was no other way to find out what was really going on. I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys and drove toward the bookstore. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, keeping to the shadows as I approached. The shop was small and cozy, its windows glowing warmly in the late afternoon light. Through the glass, I saw Chloe sitting at a small table in the back corner, her journal open in front of her. Victor was there too. He stood behind the counter at first, arranging a stack of books, but his eyes kept drifting toward Chloe. After a moment, he walked over and sat down across from her. They leaned in close, their faces animated as they talked. I couldn't hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. Victor reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Chloe's face, and she smiled, a smile I hadn't seen in months. My chest tightened as I watched them. It wasn't just the way they sat or the way they looked at each other. It was the familiarity between them, the ease of their interaction. They weren't two people casually chatting about books or work. They were something more. I stayed outside for nearly an hour, watching as they talked, laughed, and occasionally exchanged glances that made my stomach churn. At one point, Victor handed Chloe a small leather-bound book. She opened it, her face lighting up as she read something inside. It was the same look she used to give me when I surprised her with a thoughtful gift. Unable to stand it any longer, I walked back to my car and sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to calm my racing thoughts. The evidence was mounting, but it still felt surreal. Chloe wasn't the type of person to cheat. At least, that's what I'd always believed. But the woman I'd seen in the bookstore wasn't the Chloe I thought I knew. That evening, Chloe returned home as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and spent the rest of the night working on her laptop. I watched her carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or hesitation, but she seemed completely at ease. If she was hiding something, she was doing an excellent job of it. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. While Chloe was out running errands, I went through the books she'd brought home from the store. Most of them seemed normal, novels, anthologies, and collections of poetry. But tucked between the pages of one book was a folded piece of paper. My heart raced as I unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note in Victor's distinct, slanted handwriting. For my favorite storyteller. I can't wait to see what we create next. I stared at the note, my chest tightening as the words sank in. This wasn't just a professional relationship. Victor wasn't just a bookstore owner or a source of inspiration. He was something more, someone who had inserted himself into Chloe's life in a way I couldn't ignore. That night, I tried to act normal, but the tension between us was palpable. Chloe noticed, asking if everything was okay, but I brushed it off, claiming I was tired from work. Inside, I was a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, but I couldn't let it show. Not yet. I needed to be sure, to gather more evidence before confronting her. Over the next week, I paid closer attention to Chloe's behavior. I noticed the way she smiled at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, the way she tucked her journal away whenever I walked into the room. I started keeping track of her bookstore visits, noting the times and durations, piecing together a pattern that only confirmed my worst fears. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. Chloe had left for the bookstore earlier that afternoon, saying she needed time to finish a client's project. I decided to follow her again, this time prepared to capture whatever I found. Armed with my phone, I parked across the street from the shop and waited. Through the window, I saw them sitting together again, their heads close as they talked. This time, there was no mistaking their connection. Victor reached across the table, taking Chloe's hand in his. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled and leaned closer, her eyes locked on his. I hit record on my phone, capturing every second of their interaction. When they eventually left the shop together, walking side by side down the street, I followed at a safe distance. They turned a corner and disappeared into a small cafe, their laughter trailing behind them. That night, I reviewed the footage and photos I'd taken, my chest heavy with the weight of what I'd discovered. The truth was undeniable now. Chloe wasn't just spending time at the bookstore. She was building a life with someone else, a life I wasn't a part of. I couldn't shake the image of Chloe and Victor at the bookstore, laughing together, their heads close as if sharing some intimate secret. The memory of it replayed in my mind like a loop I couldn't escape. Every smile she gave me now felt hollow, every moment we spent together tainted by the knowledge that there was someone else she was sharing her time, her thoughts, her affection with. But I needed more than suspicion. I needed to be sure. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went back to the bookstore. The day I followed her started like any other. Chloe grabbed her tote bag, her journal tucked neatly inside, and left with a quick goodbye. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I parked down the street from the shop and waited, my heart pounding as I watched her through the large front window. Chloe was seated at her usual table, her journal open, her pen moving rapidly across the page. Victor stood behind the counter, watching her with a faint smile before walking over and placing a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked up, smiled warmly, and said something that made him laugh. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, leaning in close as they talked. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language spoke volumes. The way Chloe's hand rested lightly on the table close to his, the way Victor's gaze lingered on her face. It was too familiar, too intimate. I pulled out my phone and began recording, capturing the subtle gestures, the stolen glances, the quiet laughter that told me everything I needed to know. After about an hour, Chloe and Victor stood up, gathering their things. I stayed in my car as they left the shop together, walking down the street side by side. They turned a corner, and I followed at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. They stopped at a small cafe, a cozy place tucked away from the main road. Inside, they sat in a corner booth, their heads close together as they talked. Victor reached across the table at one point, his hand brushing against Chloe's. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly as she leaned closer. I snapped photo after photo, each one a dagger to the heart, but necessary to confirm what I already knew. When they left the cafe, they walked back toward the bookstore, their pace unhurried, their conversation easy. I stayed behind, watching as they disappeared into the shop, my mind racing with what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a professional relationship or a casual friendship. This was something much deeper, much more personal. That night, Chloe came home as if nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, and settled into her usual routine. Watching her carry on so effortlessly made my stomach churn. She had no idea that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack, that I was starting to see the truth behind her lies. I couldn't confront her yet, not without more evidence, more certainty. But I knew one thing for sure. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we shared was slipping away. The day I decided to confront Chloe was both the hardest and the clearest day of my life. After weeks of watching her lies unfold, of piecing together the truth from journal entries, photographs, and the hours I'd spent observing her from a distance, I knew there was no turning back. The weight of her betrayal had grown too heavy, and the facade of our life together was something I couldn't bear to live in anymore. That evening, I waited until Chloe returned from another of her bookstore visits. She walked through the door with her usual brightness, setting her tote bag on the counter and greeting me with a casual cheerfulness that now felt like mockery. She had no idea what was coming. I waited until she sat down before calmly telling her that I knew everything. Her reaction was immediate and defensive. She laughed nervously, brushing off my words as if I just told her an absurd joke. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice a little too light, her smile a little too forced. Her eyes darted to her tote bag, as if she were trying to calculate what I might have seen or found. But I didn't let her deflection faze me. I laid it all out. The late nights, the journal entries, the photos and recordings of her with Victor. Her face went pale as I spoke, her confident demeanor faltering with every word. She began to stammer, saying I'd misunderstood, that it wasn't what it looked like. She painted their relationship as harmless, a friendship born out of shared literary passions and mutual interests. But her words felt hollow, her tone desperate. When I showed her the evidence, the photos of their intimate conversations, the video of their time at the cafe, the notes from Victor hidden in her journal, her denials crumbled. She froze, staring at the screen in silence as the reality of her actions stared back at her. Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, she looked like a completely different person, smaller, defeated, exposed. Then came the tears. She begged for forgiveness, her voice shaking as she swore it was a mistake, that it hadn't meant anything, that she still loved me and wanted to fix what we had. She promised it was over, that she'd end things with Victor immediately, that we could go back to the way things were before. Her words spilled out in a torrent of desperation, but I couldn't hear them over the sound of my own heartbreak. I stood there, watching the woman I'd built my life with unravel before me. The trust we'd shared, the memories we'd built, the future I thought we were heading toward, it all felt like ashes now. Her apologies didn't erase the weeks of lies, the betrayal that had cut me deeper than I thought possible. She hadn't just betrayed me. She betrayed the foundation of everything we'd built together. I told her I couldn't forgive her. The words felt heavy as I said them, final and unyielding. Her face crumpled, her tears falling faster as she pleaded with me to reconsider. But I knew there was no going back. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we had, it was gone. No amount of apologies could rebuild the trust she destroyed. That night, I slept in the guest room, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on me like a physical force. Chloe stayed in the bedroom, her sobs muffled through the walls. I felt a strange mix of anger, sadness, and clarity. The path forward was going to be painful, but I knew it was the only way to regain the peace and honesty I deserved. The next morning, Chloe tried again to plead her case, but I didn't engage. I told her we needed space, that I would be contacting a lawyer to discuss the next steps. Her tears returned, but this time, I didn't stay to watch. I left the house, my mind racing with the enormity of what had just happened. The days following the confrontation were a blur of cold silence and shattered routines. Chloe's tearful apologies continued, but they felt like static in the background of my resolve. The trust was gone, the foundation of our marriage obliterated, and I knew there was no salvaging what she had so carelessly destroyed. It was time to move forward, and the first step was filing for divorce. I contacted a lawyer immediately, laying out the evidence I collected and explaining the situation in detail. The photos, the journal, the messages, they all painted a picture that was impossible to deny. My lawyer assured me that I had a strong case and that we'd proceed with full transparency. I wanted the divorce to be as clean and swift as possible, but a part of me also wanted something more, a sense of justice for the months of deception and betrayal I'd endured. As I sat in my car outside the lawyer's office, I thought about the bookstore, the place where so much of this had begun. Chloe and Victor had built their little world there, hiding their affair behind shelves of books and the guise of intellectual camaraderie. I knew I couldn't let that be the end of the story. If they were going to create a narrative, I'd make sure it wasn't the one they'd written for themselves. The idea for my revenge came to me as I stared at a flyer for a local charity event taped to a lamppost. It was a small gesture, one that would ripple outward in ways neither Chloe nor Victor could anticipate. I decided to make their bookstore, their sanctuary, the centerpiece of my plan. Over the next week, I reached out to local charities, community groups, and a few well-connected friends who owed me favors. I offered to sponsor a community-wide event, a pop-up book fair and fundraiser. It was a perfect opportunity to give back while shining a spotlight on the very place Chloe and Victor had tried to hide their affair. The event would be held at the bookstore, with proceeds going to literacy programs and local schools. It was altruistic on the surface, but the real purpose lay beneath. The day of the event arrived, and the bookstore was packed with people, families, local media, and members of the community who had come to support the cause. Victor was there, of course, looking pleased as he moved through the crowd, basking in the attention. Chloe attended as well, her face pale and tense as she avoided my gaze. She must have known something was coming, but she had no idea what. As the event reached its peak, I took the stage to make an announcement. I began with pleasantries, thanking everyone for their support and talking about the importance of community and literacy. Then, with a calm and deliberate tone, I shifted the focus. I also want to take a moment to highlight the incredible role this bookstore has played, not just in our community, but in my personal life. It's here that I discovered not only a love for literature, but also the truth about my marriage. The crowd fell silent. Chloe's face turned crimson, and Victor froze, his smile faltering as he realized where I was going. This bookstore, I continued, isn't just a place for stories. It's where my wife and the owner created one of their own, a tale of deceit and betrayal that's been playing out behind these shelves for months. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victor looked like he wanted to disappear, while Chloe stared at me with a mix of horror and disbelief. I handed the microphone to the stunned event organizer and walked off the stage, my job done. The fallout was immediate. The whispers turned into full-blown gossip, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Victor tried to regain control, but his attempts at damage control only made things worse. Chloe slipped out quietly, her face a mask of humiliation. Later that day, I finalized the divorce papers, sending them to Chloe with a note that simply read, "Consider this the final chapter." It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the narrative. Chloe and Victor had tried to rewrite the story of my life without my consent, and this was my way of taking it back. The bookstore became a symbol, not of their affair, but of their reckoning. The day the divorce was finalized felt surreal. Months of tension, heartbreak, and unraveling lies had finally culminated in a single moment of closure. I walked out of the courthouse with the papers in hand, the weight of my marriage lifted, but replaced with a strange emptiness. I'd won in every way that mattered. Chloe's lies had been exposed, the divorce settlement was in my favor, and her relationship with Victor had crumbled under the pressure of public scrutiny. But even victories come with scars. Chloe had tried to reach out several times after the bookstore event, pleading with me to reconsider or at the very least to stop involving others in our personal lives. But I refused to respond. She made the choices that led us here, and I had no interest in cleaning up her mess or giving her the redemption she so desperately sought. The final papers had been signed, and with them, any obligation I felt toward her was gone. Victor didn't escape unscathed either. The community's reaction to his involvement in the affair was swift and unforgiving. Customers stopped coming to the bookstore, and within a month, he'd closed its doors for good. I heard rumors that he'd moved out of town, though I didn't care enough to confirm them. He'd taken something precious from me, and now he'd lost the one thing he seemed to care about most. As for Chloe, she was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered reputation. Many of the friends she'd once charmed turned their backs on her, unwilling to associate with someone who'd caused such public humiliation. I wasn't vindictive enough to actively relish her downfall, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a certain satisfaction knowing she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. I moved forward, focusing on rebuilding my life one step at a time. The process wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness crept in and memories of the life I thought I had with Chloe haunted me. But those moments grew fewer and farther between as I rediscovered who I was outside of our marriage. In the months that followed, I poured my energy into things that brought me fulfillment. I reconnected with old friends, threw myself into work, and even started volunteering at a local community center. Each small step felt like a reclamation of the life I'd almost lost. Reflecting on everything, I realized how much I'd learned from the experience. Betrayal is a painful teacher, but it forces you to see things clearly about others and about yourself. Chloe's actions were a reflection of her own flaws, not mine. And while her lies hurt, they also gave me the clarity to walk away from something that no longer served me. Today, I'm in a better place than I thought I'd be when this all began. The scars are still there, but they've become part of the story, a reminder of what I've endured and how far I've come. To anyone reading this, life after betrayal is possible. It's not easy, but it's worth it. As for Chloe, I don't know where she is or what she's doing, and honestly, I don't care. That chapter is closed, and my story is finally my own.